Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Ramona Thümmler, Cynthy Haihambo, Julia Bialek, and Evrim Çetinkaya Yıldız will talk about trauma-informed education.
We talk about trauma-informed education today, and we thought about it and we try to start with a case study. Julia, please report us something about a case.
Okay. We want to introduce you a boy who's 6 years old, and he's in the first class of a school, and he had a lot of stress with his teachers because he kept on climbing on the tables and trampling over the notebooks and over the pens and hands and so on. And the teachers tried to stop him with several interventions. They even suspended him from the school for several weeks, but he didn't stop this behavior. And we went to watch him to understand his behavior, and we realized that there were some triggers, and the main trigger was the fact that there were situations in which he didn't know what will happen. If a person is traumatized, situations with uncertainty are a great problem, because if they have experienced that something bad had happened, they live in a constant state of threat that it will happen again. And so the little boy had to do something with his own possibilities. And he changed a very effective strategy, because climbing on the tables brought the situation under his control, because he knew what the teachers would do. And so he got control over the situation and felt safe again. Having understood these connections, the boy was asked what he needed to feel more safe, and he said he needed a place to hide. And so he built himself in a corner of the classroom a little place where he could hide. And in addition to that, we gave him more transparency in the lessons, more structure, and some possibilities were agreed to give signs when he is in emergency. So the boy was able to participate in the school, and this shows us very clear that in case of trauma, the priorities change. And the most important is to feel safe. And these strategies cannot be stopped by interventions like, if you do that, then that will happen, because there is no alternative strategy to give the people the feeling to be safe. And therefore it's very necessary for teachers to have trauma-sensitive knowledge, to apply such knowledge to develop trauma-informed interventions. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what is trauma and how it's defined.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Trauma comes from the Greek word for wound or injury, and trauma is a really stressful event. So in the first thing it is very overwhelming. We don't have enough power to cope with the situation. We feel exposed to the situation and we have no way of dealing with it. The second point, it is very unexpected, so you can't see it coming, or you won't expect that a person will do that with you. And in the third point, it causes fear and helplessness. And in the fourth point, it is very threatening, so you will remember the event your whole life, and it is a very devastating event. And I will tell you something about forced migration, because it's a very big issue in our world. In 2022, we had over 108 million people worldwide fleeing, in fact, of war, hunger, persecution and torture. So forced migration is a very big issue. Many people experience very stressful events before, during and after the forced migration, so trauma is really associated with this issue. But at the same time, not every person who was flying or who fled has a trauma. So let's take a look on the classification of trauma. So Evrim, what can you tell us about classification?
Yeah, there are different classifications of trauma, but I'm going to talk about one. We call it acute, chronic and complex trauma. The first one is acute trauma, result from a single incident like an accident. And the second one is chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged, like a domestic violence or abuse. And the third one is complex trauma, is the exposure to various kind of traumatic events, like the ones after earthquake or war, because people sometimes after this kind of events need to move to another city or country, and they also lost the loved ones, and also they have some language problems or housing problems, or they may experience poverty. So we can call this kind of trauma as complex trauma.
Thank you, Evrim. So now we want to have a look on the body and the brain. How does a stressful event affect the body and the brain? Please, Julia, tell us something about the nervous system.
So in threatening situations, the stress level arises and to enable a person to defend oneself. And this means that the sympathetic nervous system and some hormones in the body are activated, and the level arises. And if there is no possibility to get out of the dangerous situation, the stress level arises even more, and the brain will give the control to the brainstem, and the fight or flight reaction will be activated. This is an automatically triggered reaction. The person is not able to control it. If this will not bring the person out of the dangerous situation, the emergency reaction will start. And this means that a part of the parasympathetic system is activated in addition to the sympathetic system. And this is like having full gas and full brake at the same time. In this situation, a person gets into a state of freeze. It's not possible to do anything in this situation. And the impressions, all the impressions which are taken into the brain are fragments. This is a very helpful reaction because it's possible to stay alive in very threatening situations, and otherwise our system would collapse. As we heard, trauma means injury, and one part of this injury takes place in the nervous system, and a very important aspect from this injury is that the nervous system loses the ability to regulate the system. It remains either in a very high level or in a very low level, or it switches between the states, and the person is not able to change by purpose between the states, and the emergency actions are released very, very easy. And this is one part, and you will tell us something about the memory.
Yeah, I will do. So let me explain some points about the brain. We have the autobiographical memory, and it can be divided in the hot memory and the cold memory. So the cold memory includes knowledge about lifetime periods and specific events, and usually it is remembered as facts. For example, it is June, we are in the workshop for the project All-Means-All, and we are speaking about trauma. The hot memory includes emotional and sensory memories, for example, how I feel or what are my thoughts. And this is also combined with physiological elements, for example, heart beating, breathing, or sweating. And all the memories, all the hot memories, are building a fear network. So the functioning and even the structure of the brain changes when people experience very life-threatening events. So the stress changes the brain. And when we have a life-threatening event and flight is not possible and fighting is hopeless, the person will freeze. Julia explained us with the nervous system. And then our system gets alerted and the hot and the cold memory lose their interconnectivity. The data about the situation is not very well stored, so the brain gets confused. And what happens then? When the person comes into a situation with similar smells or sounds, the fear network gets activated and the person gets lost in it. We call it flashbacks. The person thinks she or he is again in the war or again in the situation with the torture or in the situation at school where friends bullied she or him. So these are really big changes in the brain, and we now want to take a look on the effects on the mental health and the physical health, and Cynthy will report us.
Thank you for the opportunity to report on the impacts of trauma on mainly two areas. Of course, there are many areas, but we simplified it to two that are most obvious in a school setting. The physical impact of trauma is that when a child experiences a traumatic experience, it affects their physical development and their participation in physical activities. The stress related to the trauma can impair the development of their immune system and their central nervous system as well. And what happens is that the child goes into isolation, they are not so healthy, they are not so willing to play, and of course for a child or for a young person, it has negative effects. Then secondly, I want to focus on the mental health impact. And a lot of these mental health impacts can manifest in symptoms like difficulties with anger management, depression, emotional distress, and sometimes it can even be more developed issues such as psychotic disorders. And these include hallucinations. The person sees flashbacks, as one of my colleagues already mentioned, flashbacks of the event. They are having an inability to concentrate. They feel continuously sad, etc. And this last set of psychotic disorders we're mentioning here, if the teacher, for example, in a school situation observes this kind of issues that are quite advanced, it is important that they rather refer these issues to a professional, because this is not really within the operational framework of a teacher to handle.
Yeah, so thank you, Cynthy. And we're talking to teachers in this video, so we want to know what are the effects on children's educational process.
Yeah, of course, that is the most obvious effect when a child has experienced trauma. The teacher might see that the ability of the child to learn reduces. And it's not because the child has a learning difficulty or an attention deficit disorder or something like that. It is because their system, the traumatic event, kind of attacks their system and their ability to learn. And that starts from forming relationships, managing their feelings, and of course it leads into emotional and behavioral difficulties. And if these are not managed well, it makes the learning environment very difficult for the child, him or herself, because most likely they get bullied and people are starting to avoid them. makes it difficult for the teacher. It makes it also difficult for other learners in the school environment. So trauma, it creates that cycle of you have a traumatic event and your mental and physical health is attacked, your behavior changes, and when your behavior changes, most likely it leads to you being bullied and being rejected and receiving negative feedback. And the teacher responds with a punishment, most likely, if they are not sensitive and do not have this awareness of trauma-informed education. They give you a punishment, and what does the punishment do? It just creates a secondary trauma. And that is why we think that when teachers find themselves in this situation, first, teachers need to be aware, of course, of the different backgrounds of their learners, so that they can see that maybe this child is going through a traumatic event. Then they should refrain from blaming or labeling the child. Instead, they should try to work on achievable targets. They should have a conversation with the child to find out what would work, like the case study that Julia gave us in the beginning, where they made an intervention to have someone who has more advanced knowledge come in and listen and observe and develop targets that are achievable for the child. So the importance of trauma-informed education cannot be overemphasized, because this type of awareness helps teachers to reduce that re-traumatization, as we have said in the beginning. And a teacher who has trauma-informed education will also be in a position to advise parents and the child and restore kind of the peaceful environment in the classroom.
So it seems to be that it's very important to have a look for schools. So Evrim, what would you say, why is trauma-informed education really needed at schools?
Yeah, actually children around the world experience high rates of trauma, and these are including migration, war, and any other kinds of traumas. And when this happens, schools become critically important, because there are a lot of schools and millions of children are attending to a school. So it's easier for professionals to reach the children through schools. And also schools are very important in community mental health issues. And also schools should meet the emotional and social needs of children in general, and also this leads to general well-being of the society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Julia, you are very often in schools and you talk about trauma and trauma-informed education. Maybe could you explain us what knowledge should teacher have about trauma-informed education?
Yes, it's very important for teachers to know what is the definition of trauma, what is trauma and what is not trauma. Then they have to know the symptoms of trauma and how they can distinguish the symptoms from other symptoms and the effects on the behavior, maybe on the body, on the dynamics and relationships, and on the learning process, as we heard. And it's necessary to know how to respond on the needs of traumatized students, and how school can be created as a safe place. Therefore, methods are necessary, methods to regulate the stress level, and how to approach students in crisis situations and stressful situations. And another very important point is to know about the effects of trauma on oneself, because it needs a lot of stress management to cope with these situations of trauma, and this is a point we will to carry on with.
Thank you, Julia. So I think the teachers hear a lot of stories from their students, and to hear trauma is very exhausting. So Evrim, why it is important for teachers to look for their own well-being?
Teachers already have a stressful job, and they are quite busy with all the other work, and they are receiving a little or sometimes no support from any other people. So they are at risk for burnout. And usually research says that they don't pay enough attention to their own well-being. So teachers' psychological and physical health is important for themselves and also for the students and for the quality of education. It is just, we can say that it is just like what happens in a flight. Teachers should wear their mask first and then help other students through education and trauma-sensitive education.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.